Hello there and welcome to the Second Life Book Club. My name is Draxtor Dupre. Different time today, 10 p.m. Second Life time, because on the show we have writer and philosopher Damon A. Young, and he comes to us from Australia. He comes to the metaverse from Australia, so we had to negotiate the time. With the time zones, with virtual worlds solving all problems of presence, the time zones are still a big obstacle. Damon was on the show before, but he is such a prolific writer that he needed to get his own show because he was on a panel before. His new book is called On Getting Off: Sex and Philosophy. It's out from Scribe. Welcome, Damon. How are you?
I'm well, thank you. How are you?
Very good. It's very early, but that suits me. I used to be in morning radio, so I actually like that hour. Um, Damon, now we're gonna get right into it because you are using the F word in this book a lot, and you actually explain, and you're going to read also a passage where you kind of go into the history of it. And when I was prepping the show, I was going like, okay, if we use the F word, will YouTube can scan through the audio in real time, and as we're streaming it, they may actually restrict it. But I signed up this YouTube stream to be for adults. You can click if it's for kids or not for kids. So I think we're safe. But can you briefly explain why you chose in this book to use the F word uh, instead of an alternative?
Okay,
Actually,
so
you
would you
do
like
use
the
the S word as well. So sorry, go ahead.
would you like the explanation or the reading? Because that's part of the reading, but I'm happy to give you the quick explanation.
Give us a super quick, and then that's also the tease for the longer reading.
For sure. Okay, so the quick explanation is sex is a clinical word. It is the polite word. It is the formal word of governments and schools and so on. And I have no problem with that. I do use it throughout the book, but it seems to miss whole aspects of human experience. It's one thing to say of someone they had sex. It is quite another thing to say they fucked or they screwed or they went at it. And it seemed to me that as a philosopher, but also as an author, uh, to only describe it as sex in that clinical way would be to rob the manuscript of that sort of visceral aspect of experience. Um,
But you're a
to say fuck
philosopher.
is.
But I'm sorry to jump in here. Are you not afraid that your friends in academia are put off by this?
Look, it's a possibility, but first of all, it is a book for a general audience. It's not an academic book,
Hmm.
although it has been reviewed and taken seriously by academics. But secondly, I would think less of any thinker who let that put them off. That seems a very shallow reason to disregard a work simply because it has swearing in it.
Hmm. I could not agree more, and thank you for putting it that way. There is a lot of other sort of obsession with decorum that really detracts from issues. I don't think we have to spell out that in international politics and in various nation states, this seems to be the go-to thing. Well, he did say that, and I object to that, and that becomes a red herring that really
Yes.
detracts from sort of the core what we really want to talk about.
And also, you can be cruel, you can be dismissive, you can demonstrate all kinds of vices in very polite language.
Hmm.
The fact that you're speaking formally or politely doesn't mean you're nice or good or caring, or fair.
Now, I want to invite the audience right away. Please shower us with comments in the local chat here. I'm looking at it. Shyla is looking at it too, our researcher, co-producer, and she'll feed me in direct message if I miss it. Please cut and paste and be obnoxious about it if it streams by too fast. Also on YouTube, big welcome to Kitten Duo. It's a different time, but Kitten Duo is a subscriber and a member of the Draxtor channel on YouTube. Welcome, kittens. Awesome to have you. And now, Damon, this book, and we'll talk about it later too, because the you write for general audiences, and you have a lot of other books that that I wouldn't say simplify, but that bring philosophy, which can be a word that spawns terror in people of very very complex um, things that they don't want to engage with, and you have such an incredible talent to make this accessible without losing that depth. So we'll talk
Thank
about
you.
this too. I want to start with the content warning. I'm very very happy that you put a content warning in the beginning of your book, and the way you put it there is is really great. I have asked authors previously here on the book show to comment on trigger warning or content warning, whatever you may call it. And it seemed to me that previous guests have sort of evaded this issue. I don't know why. Maybe they haven't really thought about it that much, or maybe they were concerned if they would speak out one way or the other in this sort of polarized discussion about content warning. But I just put up a slide behind us here, and you write in the book, this warning is not a stop sign, it is a map. I'm showing you where much of the difficult terrain lies. The territory is yours to explore. And then you basically have the chapters of the book. And for example, first chapter, clowns. And you list the issues that you discuss here: bestiality, transphobia, and then, of course, the favorite chapter of everybody, fuckzilla, violent sex. I don't know if that's everybody's favorite chapter. My favorite word in the whole book is furries. But talk a little bit about the importance for you, content warning, trigger warning. Um, yeah, go ahead.
Okay, so I think it's naive to approach a topic like this and not assume that it might not be really difficult for some people who have experienced all kinds of trauma. Um, and I know not only from research, but from personal experience that if you are traumatized and you are suffering from some kind of um, uh, syndrome as a result of that, that you can feel triggered, for want of a better. I don't like the word. I think it sounds mechanical. It makes it sound
Yeah.
like we're these machines just waiting for our buttons to be pushed. But I also know that that's sometimes what it feels like if you're having a panic attack. That it feels like you are merely this thing to which things are happening, and you want it to stop. So I take that seriously, and that's why up front I want to say, look, this book deals with some heavy stuff. On the other hand, I also want to respect people's autonomy, their agency, and say, look, you know your trauma better than I do.
Right.
You know what predisposes you towards anxiety or agony or worry. Here's what I'm going to be talking about. I trust you to know what to do with it.
This is so great, David. This is one of those things where it's so clear the way you put it, the way you give the agency to the reader. But and it seems to me that this is a model that could be adopted by so many other people. And to my knowledge, it's not. I mean, there's a huge discussion in Germany about a black woman in Germany who wrote a book and who has been doxxed by right wingers, and she decided not to go to the big book fair because she was afraid for her life and the life of her kids. And the papers wrote about her, say, "Oh, you just got to pull yourself together. You're too sensitive. Come on, it's not that big of a deal." And so the reason why I'm mentioning this case is this is what you always hear. Oh, people are just too sensitive. They got to pull themselves together. And the word trigger is also then, as you're suggesting, used in that kind of like blasé way, like, oh my God, you're just too weak, basically.
Yeah. And look, anyone who has any familiarity with trauma knows that it's not a question of weakness. This isn't a case of people who are just a bit precious. But at the same time, there are people who do work with trauma daily, who've researched it systematically and earnestly and sincerely. and who've come to the conclusion that trigger warnings don't necessarily help.
Mm.
In some cases, they can prime people rather than helping them deal with their trauma. Certainly, that people have said it doesn't necessarily have any therapeutic function. Hence, once again, why my point here is not to say, okay, here are the things that will trigger you, because you're just a machine that can be turned on and on. I'm just saying, here is the territory. You will know what to make of it, and this is, I wrote The Art of Reading partly to put attention back on the agency of the reader rather than the power of the author. And it's kind of what I'm doing here too,
Mm.
saying, look, it's your agency. If you don't think you can deal with these topics, then don't read about them. This
I
is what
should
they
say
are.
that in the sorry to jump in here because I forgot we put this we use the F word, the the fuck word, which also you use the term screwing, which is awesome.
Yeah.
I really like the term screwing. But here in the audience, please put in local chat if you're put off by the F word. We did it. I did it the other way around. We talked about the content warning, and we had already possibly possibly made people uncomfortable by using the F word. Now you're using three words or terms that describe parts of a relationship: the libido, the erotic, and the romantic aspects. And I put a quote in the back here: "The libidinal, erotic, and romantic need not come together in one lover. We can fuck without devotion, adore without horniness, gape without love." So this is what you put at in the beginning of the book, uh, I guess to signal to the reader that you're going to go full head on with the complexity of the topic.
Yeah.
Cody actually in the sorry, Cody says I don't give a fuck. Squawkin says more than happy with the F word. Jessica says please use it, and Jamonkey says F no. Yeah,
Yeah,
so the
I really
terminology.
wanted to decouple. So, okay, so I wanted to give a somewhat holistic notion of what sex is, a broad picture, because there's this common trend that sex is reduced to just one thing. Okay, sex is the libido. That's what it is. It's just about getting off. And I absolutely want to recognize that, but at the same time say, yeah, but if you look at sexual experience and sexuality, it's not just about that. Sex also includes the erotic, the way in which we're drawn to others aesthetically, and it also involves the romantic, the way in which we form these couple hoods or triple hoods, depending on what your jam is. That has to do with romance is addressed to an other as an other and trying to understand them as an other rather than just reducing them to yourself. And sex can be all three of those, two and not one, just one. And,
Mhm.
and it's, I didn't want to be horribly reductionist about it and just say, no, 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 we know what sex is. It's just about hormones, or it's just about love, the other side, purely about love. This is purely about this oneness of spirits coming together. And I'm sorry, but that just leaves out a great deal of sexual experience.
Is that something that you found in your research? I mean, there's such an amazing reading list in in the back of the book, also fiction, nonfiction, social science. Is that what you found mostly in your research that people do over the centuries where this has been discussed in literature and in study? People kind of reduce it to one or the other.
Yes, yes. I
Mm,
mean, even in Plato, who said, ultimately desire should be turned towards the good and the just and the beautiful. So you desire someone, and then you realize what you're desiring is their beauty, but you're actually desiring, beauty in general, which is actually the form of beauty. And so through lust, you orient yourself towards the, transcendence and the divine. But even Plato and the Greeks weren't exactly against sex. They were a horny bunch. But
mm,
even Plato said, still, it's best if you don't have sex. So if you're in love with someone, the best relationship is chaste. And that is a thread that runs through the whole of philosophy, where sex is reduced to this kind of savage, nasty, bestial urge that is antithetical to thought and hence the highest dignity of humanity. And yeah, it's just false. It's
Mhm.
just wrong. Not only is it wrong about what sex is, it's wrong about its value. Even if it were this savage, bestial thing, that's not so bad.
Mhm. It's interesting that you also you write in the book that most people who wrote about this topic and still do happen to be white men. And actually,
Yeah.
this is a quote that our researcher Shyla extracted from an interview that you gave.
Yep.
You say, I looked at what philosophers have said about sex and the kind of big philosophers. When I say big philosophers, I typically mean white men. The typical philosophers have either said nothing or they've said it's bad or they've said it's dangerous. Now, in honor to white men, I put up some pictures here and photos and painters of some white men on the side. If the camera can kind of pan over the side here, we got, of course, Sigmund our friend Sigmund over there, who
Yes.
is problematic in many ways. I mean, he paved the way in the beginning, but as you said, he was a deep thinker until he found a sexual issue, and then he stopped thinking, and he said, "That's
Yeah,
it,
absolutely.
case
Yeah.
closed." We got Thomas Aquinas now. Damon, I mean, your avatar is white, but also we happen to know that in the physical realm, you're also a white man. So you
Yes.
put yourself into this long line of white men, but
Yep.
are you claiming that you have more to offer than these other white men?
I'm claiming that I'm more aware of, the fact that I'm a beneficiary of all kinds of power relations than some of these other thinkers were. And I'm more aware of the way in which those power relations may shape my philosophical ideals. And it is so depressing as a thinker to read the history of philosophy. And there are these
Yes.
incredibly keen minds whose passion, whose genuine passion is to reflect on the taken for granted, to do away with prejudices and biases. And then you look at what they say about sex and women, and it's just fucking stupid. And so, and
Even
why?
recently, I mean, even
Yeah,
recently, we could say that they were children or men of their time, but that goes to fairly recent
yes, it
analysis, I guess.
does. And it looking and and it's no coincidence that they were beneficiaries of a system that created those very biases. Like that shouldn't surprise us, but it's really frustrating nonetheless to see how they question so many things, but not these. And it there has been some progress, and philosophy is now slightly more diverse than it was. And lo and behold, there are more diverse conversations and conclusions happening. But nonetheless, I am well aware that I am very representative of the discipline.
Now, if you're just tuning in, this is in fact the Second Life Book Club at a different time with Damon Young, Damon A. Young, not to be confused with the other Damon Young when you Google him. You gotta Google Damon Young Australia, I think. And I know people were like teased. Okay, we're gonna talk about machines, masturbation, furry sex, and so on and so forth. And yes, we will. And we'll also talk about Shyla posing question: How do we get out of those opinions of a woman's role versus a man role? I do have also a question about women maybe thinking that they have agency and power over their sexuality, but still playing into men's desires in a patriarchal system. Especially here in Second Life, there's a lot of emphasis in some circles on beautiful avatars, and I've seen communities where people are literally shamed of having avatar skins that are a year or two old. So it's basically replicating in this wonderful virtual world that is so free, theoretically, of these pressures that people just sort of I don't know, not voluntary, but I guess we're so conditioned to want to please the other. I know Cody is typing here. Cody, I'll give you time because Cody is very good looking in real life and in Second Life, and he and we had conversations about good looking um, avatars. But anyway, before we go to read, Damon, quick comment on, I don't know, the ubiquity of these stereotypical beauty models that are being replicated uh, everywhere, and even we think, we need to adhere to them, or we think we're actually free of them, but then we're just tapping into them. I mean, I'm not
Yep.
completely free of that. In Second Life, people were, I was in the gay community a couple of years ago doing a video, and one of the guys said, "Hey, Draxter, what skin do you wear?" And Second Life said, "Well, I'm using Slink like from 2013," and he goes, "What? Oh my God!" And he was telling his friends, "My God, Dragster, he's like he needs to get a new skin." So those pressures, like I said, exist here as well.
Yeah. Okay. So the first thing is we cannot get away from beauty. We simply cannot. We respond immediately and powerfully to the beautiful, and that's not something we can do away with. In fact, I have a chapter in this on the book on the way in which beauty undoes us. It picks at the neat order of our minds and sort of deflates a bit of our agency. So that's the first thing to say. You're still thinking about beauty. Yeah, we all are. We can't get away from it. The second thing is we also have to recognize that because of that, beauty matters in society. So we might say morally, there is a serious problem when we attribute virtues to someone because of their looks, for example. And there is a classic trope in TV and cinema and books where the villains have a scar or
Hmm.
some kind of impairment, and the heroes are beautiful. That's absolutely replicating a really dodgy trope, that we're kind of reading moral beauty off physical beauty. What we can't do, however, is deny that physical beauty plays an enormous role in our society. And the studies on this are very straightforward. People who are considered attractive um, are higher paid, they are more highly rewarded at school, they are seen as have possessing all kinds of scholastic and workplace virtues that they don't necessarily have.
Sorry to jump in
Um,
here, Damon. I don't I'm not disputing this at all, but I hope that in these studies, and that you, and I think you address this in the book. I mean, beauty. When we talk about beauty, to me, again, this is very subjective, and this is also changing over times. There
okay,
were
so this,
women
yeah,
were it was there was a certain woman, a sort of more heavier set woman was on vogue, and then it wasn't, and
yes,
then it's again, and so the pendulum swings back and forth.
yeah, okay, so there are certain regularities, generalities in our sense of what is beautiful, certain kinds of symmetry, for example, that seem to be enduring and more international. Um, Nonetheless, most of the time, we respond to beauty that is fashionable. We respond to beauty that is all tied up with status. So we are drawn to all kinds of things. And again, the studies show that, yeah, we respond to beauty, but we equally respond to a whole lot of other signs that suggest health or success or confidence. But the more general point I want to make there is we can't saying that people are superficial for being interested in beauty, and I'm not saying you're saying that, but anyone who thinks it's superficial to be interested in beauty is denying a core aspect of human existence. The question is not, are we responding to beauty? The question is our interest in beauty exploitative? Is it exploiting us or exploiting others? And that is a very different question.
Very well said. One second, Damon. I'm getting a lot of different messages of latecomers. Um, Jules is coming. I'm just telling her to ask in the group where to go, because if I teleport her here, she will appear on the stage. Now, let's let's start reading, and thank you for explaining this very well. I want to add that to me, it's, I think what I was objecting to is a very narrow, you know, call it Ken and Barbie type of over sexualized avatars that are very popular in some circles in Second Life and other games, that I just find yeah, I find it reductive, and I find it sort of a mirror where you limit yourself by mirroring what sort of the physical world demands, right?
Possibly, I don't know. I mean, you'd have to do some research on it to find out why they're drawn to it and what they're doing with it.
Damon, you're the researcher. I'm a opinionated host. I just throw the stuff out
you
there.
know, I mean,
No, you're
I
making a
mean,
great point. Please continue. No, that's
this
good. Yeah,
this is a sociological question.
yeah.
I don't think we can read off necessarily people's experiences from what they wear. I know that in terms of class and status, unfortunately, there are quite strong associations between what you wear, um, how you walk, how you talk, how you eat, the sports you do, the leisure you enjoy, and your class and status. That research is done and it's quite clear. What that doesn't show is why you're drawn to it and what it means to you. And I think it's really important as social researchers, as philosophers, as commentators, not to reduce other people to our sort of picture of their social position. Um, we, we we
For
don't know
Christ's
why
sakes.
they're wearing what they're wearing.
God damn it, Damon. You're so correct. And I preach this all the time, and then I fall into my own sort of the trap that I accuse other people of this judging, especially in the Second Life context. You have no idea what I have to push back against in the real world with this obsession and this enthusiasm. So let's read from a chapter, Vulgar,
Sure.
not the Vulgate, where
Yes.
you explain a little bit the usage of the fuck word.
Yep.
And I would like to ask you to please stand up and go in front of the book stand here. And
Yep.
while you're doing that, I'm going to read a few comments here. Squawking says, I'm a griffin because I just don't want to do the whole appearance thing, but I admire gorgeous avatars when I see them. That's why
Yep.
you are a griffin. I thought you were a griffin because you want to represent your people, but it's just out of laziness, Squawking. That is very
All right.
disappointing. Damon, you're positioned well. Let me read
Thank
a
you.
couple of more comments. Jamonkey said, read an article that said May West and Twiggy had similar geometric ratios, even though they look quite different and represented different cultural norms of beauty for their times. May West and Twiggy, very good comment. Stranger says, remember when there was a book called Dress for Success that told you things like that? You would be treated as lower class if you wore a blue raincoat. I mean, that is still very much happening. Uh, don't want to get off a tangent because my wife is also writing a paper about how people are judged in the blink of an eye based
Yes.
on raincoats and whatnot and ties and stuff. Okay, Damon, what are we gonna hear?
Okay, we are going to hear from the chapter The Vulgar, not the Vulgate, on often avoiding the word sex. So, shall I go at it,
Please.
so to speak? A brief note on the word sex. I find myself avoiding it often. It is an ugly word, not because it is boorish, but because it is too refined. It's clinical, sterile, precise, institutional. It comes from the Norman French, originally Latin, what philologists Rene and Henry Kahane call the status symbol of the rich, the powerful, the refined, and the snobbish. It is the word of aristocratic victors looking down upon Anglo Saxon oiks. Even today, sex belongs in the official lexicon of government, business, and academia. Adults use it in treatises and memoranda, often without sniggers or twitches. It is acceptable, that is to say, safe. It is also very modern. For most of its history, sex meant the division of the species into male and female. It also meant genitals, a connotation that lasted at least 3 centuries from the 17th to the 20th. And it's not until the 20th century that we find people talking about sex as an activity. Screw, by the way, first in print during the early 18th century. Suffolk County Court Records, 1719. Mr. Boyd screwed Mr. Long's maid of Charlestown. A far better word for intercourse than sex is fuck. Perhaps an ancient Germanic borrowing with an older Indo-European origins, we find it in a 16th century Scottish courtier's poem in William Dunbar's A Man of Valour to His Fair Lady from 1513. A coiffed but clumsy youth shows he wants to sleep with his girlfriend. Be his fairest, he would have fuck it, or by his behaviour, he would have fucked. The word turns up again in an Italian-English dictionary under the definition of fotere, to jape, to sard, to fuck, to swive, to occupy. In 1598, the English had some wonderful words for sex, but only fuck is still with us. Now, this is partly the word's force, the breathy F, and then percussive K. It's fun to say and to pair with other words. From my own Australia, fuckwit. Put simply, as descriptions for copulation, I prefer the slang to the formal terminology. Of course, sex is more than fucking. This is the very basis of my philosophy. But insofar as I write about intercourse, I choose the vulgar over the vulgate. Now, this is partly an aesthetic decision. Most superficially, sex is a clumsy word. It lacks the power of fuck or even the levity of bonk or Roger. Even doing it is better, with its suggestion of anonymous private labours. Sex also has a medical atmosphere, a mood of rubber gloves and forceps, and no judgment if this is your fetish. To say sex rather than fuck is often to prefer the physician's perspective to the lover's. This view is not false, but it is partial. It leaves out the first-person intimacy of screwing, the immediate feeling of self and other that arises here amongst things, rather than from the Archimedean point. This might seem aesthetic too, but it actually concerns a vision of reality I quietly encourage. In Why the World Does Not Exist, philosopher Marcus Gabriel writes, "We prematurely create world pictures and in the process forget ourselves. I write fuck instead of sex because I am trying not to forget myself." And that was that.
And that's Damon Young reading from On Getting Off, out now from Scribe in the UK and in Australia and around the world. Uh, Wonderful reading, Damon. Thank you. I
Thank
was
you.
distracted a little bit because as a host, I need to check the local chat. And Tsai here, regular book clubber, said, at least Water is an otter because I had unprotected sex with a furry. Now, Water is her son. He's right next to her. And Tsai is mentioning furry. So I have furry in my run sheet uh, because the word furry or the plural is in fact in your book. I'm
Yeah.
trying to locate my slide because you're talking about basically, I guess, fetishes to get one's rocks off,
Yeah.
and you use stiletto heels, and you use furries in that sentence. Oh yeah, here I got the slide. So you're right. There are biological urges, however, fungible into stiletto heels or furries. I actually had to look up fungible. Weird because NFT is everybody's talking about it. So
Yes.
explain what you meant by this, and then the related question, of course, why use the poor furries? The furry culture is not always about sex,
No,
or
it's not.
or
No,
yeah.
I agree. Okay, so the first thing, my point here is simply that it's I'm trying to combine two really important aspects of sexuality. First, we have these basic physiological urges that rise up within us, and they're not necessarily something we can control, and they're not necessarily something we plan or think about in any straightforward way. They happen to us sometimes. That's what it feels like. They are us, but it feels like it's happening to us. However, those urges don't map neatly onto something like heterosexual procreation between a man and woman blessed in the Church of God.
Mhm.
You can desire all kinds of strange things, and most of the time there's nothing wrong with that. And so what I'm saying here is, yeah, you have what we might call natural urges, natural in inverted commas there, because nature is a very human category, and we pack all kinds of things into it. But it's fungible, it's transformable into all kinds of fetishes. For stiletto heels as worn, for stiletto heels as seen, for stiletto heels stepping on you, if that's what you like, or furries. Yeah, some people are interested in anthropomorphized animal selves in a platonic sense. Others find it gets their rocks off. I just wanted to nod to that.
Mhm. I think it's perfect. The reason why I bring it up is that a lot of people in the furry community, they are, and you're not doing this at all, but they're tired of just also kind of reducing furry culture into sort of a weird sex fetish.
Yeah,
Um,
I absolutely didn't want to do that.
so now let's go to the origin of the universe, uh, which the universe, or at least Mesopotamia, was created through masturbation, as we all know. I
Yep.
actually didn't, but I read this and then I put it into the group, and a lot of people in the group, when I was teasing the show yesterday, they were like, "Oh yeah, I know Enki created it by sort of wanking, by rubbing one out and spilling it
Yeah.
into Mesopotamia." Can you summarize that tale, and also in the context, because there are other creation myths that are very similar.
Yeah. So I sort of set this up as a little story where we have Enki, this god who has created civilization itself. So he finds himself in this dry valley, um, and somewhere below him there's sweet water, fresh water, but it's sandy, dry soil, and he's alone, and he wants to create. He wants to be among others in a world, thrumming with activity. So he does the obvious thing that a man would do in those circumstances. He jerks off. By doing that, he fills the Tigris with his semen, and essentially makes civilization as we know it. I mean, that really was the first true civilization, uh, and it was because, yeah, he had to get one out. And
Now,
so there are others
yeah, go ahead.
in the Satapatha Brahmana, which is Iron Age India. Prajapati masturbated in the same way, and there are others too. It comes up quite a bit, so to speak.
Except for then when we move into the dominating Christian tradition, that is the polar opposite.
Yeah, and that's what really interested me, because in a lot of these creation myths, they might not be quite as sexual as Anki. I mean, you do get a lot of sexual creation. The clouds mating with the earth, or gods mating to create land, or at least the other gods. Um, but even when there's not sex, there's some kind of viscerality to it. There's fishing, or there's bits of the body that get cut off. There's massacres and so on in the Norse tradition. What you find in the Old Testament is just words, and there's no flesh to it, to the making of the universe. It's done with speech, and then life is formed with breath. And it's this sense of, you know Anki, this Mesopotamian myth, is very hands-on, whereas God, Yahweh, is hands-off. And there's a really interesting um, continuity there in the Jewish and later Christian traditions. In fact, I'd say it's even stronger in the Christian tradition, of this kind of otherworldliness, of an interest in what is ethereal and breathy and otherworldly, rather than um, what oozes or drips or squirts.
And we're still in that very much, I think, dominated by this, the kind of, I don't know, is it a disdain for bodily
Yes,
functions in the
100%. Yeah, it's seen as abject.
Jessica here in the local chat says, she says, men are so funny. I guess that's a comment of like when you were saying this was the obvious thing to do, basically jerk off. And in context here is a quote from Clifford Geertz, I think a contemporary philosopher. I don't know who he is, but it's in your book. There is a quote: "Man, man is an animal suspended in webs of significance he himself has spun."
Yes.
What does that mean? Sort of a self-absorption thing?
Um, Sort of, but that's in a slightly different chapter. But the point there is that it's impossible for humans to do away with meaningfulness. We
Mhm.
can't do away with the fact that the world has significance for us. And so when someone like Freud says, aha, that's about sex, well, we understand it now. They treat it like, okay, well, once you've found sex, that's all it. Whereas my point there is, no, 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 no. We can't avoid meaning. We can't avoid asking questions or significance. And then we don't just end with sex. We then ask, okay, well, what does sex mean? What is the significance of sex and sexuality? And just getting back to one more thing, the comment from Jess, which was "men are so funny." The end of the first section of that chapter on Enki, the masturbating god, it ends with me telling my wife about this, Ruth, and her replying, "How like a man." I just thought so. There's a very common response there.
Well, to be fair, I think Jessica is also Australian. This might be locally. I don't know. No, I mean, actually, the other quote that I have here, which is more apt to this, or
Yep.
just also related to men which are dominating, for better or for worse, our our culture and have for a long time, despite some people claiming, some white men claiming that they're losing, and they're taken over by feminism and blah 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 bullshit. This quote is from Blaise Pascal, a French philosopher of the 17th century, and he says the sole cause of man's unhappiness is that he does not know how to stay quietly in his room. I guess unless he has time masturbating, but he or he spends time. But comment on this maybe, uh, and what came to mind when I read this, also the whole phenomenon of actually forced isolation, not through COVID, but also before, but young men, and this goes into the whole thing about toxic masculinity. You don't really write about it in the book, but uh, got distracted by a comment here. Cody says, "I love jacking off. It's good." But anyway, Damon, the
Yes.
men's unhappiness uh, coming from the inability to spend time with with himself.
Yes.
Pun somewhat intended, I guess. I don't know if it's a pun.
Yeah, I think that was in the context of the discussion of Fuckzilla, where I
Right.
comment on the model, the sex worker, the model in the porn video, who demonstrates her capacity to sit quietly for a long time and endure her own company because she has to in order to film this masturbation scene. So I'm using Pascal in a slightly different form than he might have wanted, being a fervent Christian.
I see. See, I highlighted so many um, things in your book, and then I put them into my run sheet, And thank you for providing the context, because now we're with the fuck machine, which has
Yep.
to do with machinery, um, which is also a, I don't know, the boogeyman of a lot of people, saying, well, we have machines
Yeah.
and we lose intimacy because of the machines. Comment on that chapter. What have you learned researching the use of machines?
Um, so I think the first thing I want to say is my first book was about distraction, and it's literally titled Distraction. And one thing I noticed when it was published was that uh, most radio stations and television stations and newspaper reporters just wanted to talk about distractions and computers or
Hmm.
phones. And it was the idea that if we're distracted, if there's a problem, it's the fault of the technology, rather than asking why is it that we're distracted and what are we finding valuable in this experience and why are we so vulnerable to it. So that's just a sort of side comment, but it does go to my response, and that is that um, technology is often this kind of boogeyman, the idea that, okay, so this video shows a woman who's being fucked by this giant dildo on a robot that just kind of, it's like power fucking, just kind of massive thrusting power with this huge rubber cock. And she's moaning and groaning, and it's incredible, and she can't help but be so turned on because of its enormity. And a lot of the YouTube comments, or the comments on the video, oh wow, men are over, we're finished, the machines are just going to satisfy women and they won't need us. And there's so many, I have a number of responses to that. The first is the idea that, um, what does it say about men's belief in their own capacities to offer fulfilling intimacy, whether it's purely carnal or romantic or otherwise?
Right.
To put it, I think men know they're not doing the job, is the short version of that. The second one, though, is that it's the idea that machines are the enemy somehow, rather than another way that humans can relate intimately. And if you talk to a lot of couples, whether they're queer or straight or a cisgender or trans, there are all kinds of couples and threesomes and groups, and sometimes they use machines for mutual pleasure. And this sort of science fiction vision of the robots turning up and rogering women to bliss and men being useless is, it's exactly that. It's a fantasy that has nothing to do with the way in which humans actually relate and use technology to pleasure themselves and one another. What I actually talk about in the chapter is how, first of all, I talk about my own boredom. So I'm watching this model um, being fucked by, the fuckinator or the anal plunger or the hammer or whatever
The
it's called.
intruder.
Yeah, the intruder. And I get, it's nothing to me. It's just, I'm bored by it, and so that's why I start thinking about Pascal and all kinds of other things. But the second thing is, it's this vision of powerful necessity, um, where things must be, where pleasure must be and the orgasm must be, and it's a vision of a very masculine portrait of virility, where you are so hard and lasting and potent that this gorgeous woman cannot help but be pleasured by you. Just, you're
Mhm.
overwhelming her with your power. And of course, it's a fantasy. It's a it's a pornographic fantasy of some men's vision of themselves. Now, is it harmful? I don't think so. Um, I actually contacted the model to
Harmful
ask.
to, wait a minute, harmful to
Yeah.
consume or harmful to engage, or both?
Oh no, I was thinking purely of it in terms of, the consumption of a
Hmm.
particular vision of sexuality. The idea that it's feeding into stereotypes, or it's feeding into, patriarchic fantasies of virility
Right.
and so on. Whereas in fact, there are there are, women I know who use these machines and enjoy them, and they're not doing it because of some male gaze. They're doing it because the machines are designed to do a really good job.
While the men do the laundry, the real men.
Yeah, and I mean,
Yeah.
sure, I don't have a problem with that.
Neither have I, but a lot of people who feel again that men are losing. Again, this has to do with this view of what masculinity is. I mean,
Yes,
it's fascinating to observe this cultural moment and these types of discussions. Sometimes I feel we're back in the 50s.
yeah,
Anyway,
I
I'm going
agree.
off a slight tangent here, but it all kind of evokes your reading your book. It all kind of fits in these other thoughts.
Yep. I mean, again, getting back to libido, eros, and romance, it the important thing is to be clear about what aspects of sexuality you're trying to encourage. So if you're purely about libido, if you just want to get your rocks off, then that's what you're using it for. If you want that, but also romance, then you use these machines as part of an intimate relationship with one or two or how many people. The important thing is to be clear about what you're doing and why it's valuable, and what's your kind of ultimate vision of human flourishing.
Now, this leads actually perfectly to a section here that I have prepared about fantasy, because you mentioned fantasy and machines can help.
But just kind of, unfortunately, porn doesn't.
Oops, I think we have Damon. Can you still hear me?
Yeah.
Ah, I think we had a little lag here. Uh,
If I can just say something
Go
very
ahead,
briefly,
please.
there's a question about contacting the model. I did contact the model, just kind of doing my research or diligence to say, could you tell me about your experience of using the machine? Unfortunately, I never heard back from her, which is completely understandable because she would be contacted by randoms, 24 hours a day asking questions. So,
Right.
however, I have spoken to women who have used similar machines to get their experiences of them.
They get contacted by people who claim they are philosophers all day
Yeah,
long.
exactly. I mean, wow, this guy's desperate. Wow.
She's like,
Of
he's
all the
showing
excuses.
the email to her friends and go like, "Can you believe this? This guy is making up he's a philosopher." Uh, I want to talk about fantasy, and here's a quote from the book where you say, "To make sense of fantasy, four excellences seem especially helpful: curiosity, patience, bravery, and perseverance." And quick anecdote: I'm currently working on a series called Love Mate in Second Life, where we portray profile couples that have met in Second Life and that they are together or married
Yep.
or in a relationship, and they met through their avatars. And what's really fascinating, of course, is that they fall in love with their avatars, and very often they reveal their physical identity very late in the game, and they stay together. So certain physical characteristics are not necessarily deal breakers. But I'm working on this story right now, which is fascinating, where the woman, they were both on a video call, and the woman tells me that, well, I found him very attractive. I found Ross really attractive. We got along really great, but he was kind of shy. And then I made a move and to say, let's do some sexual role play in Second Life. They were already in sort of a medieval role playing sim, and I believe it was text and a little voice, and she initiated this. And I said, so how did that go? And she says, well, it went really bad. And I don't want to get into it because this is a family show, Dragster. I know it, but I want to ask you, Damon, about this. And there's a lot of levels here
Yep.
to this story, which is also the woman took the first step. It was bad, and I think it was because he didn't reciprocate in the or he was she said he wasn't really talented, he didn't know what to do, and it was really embarrassing. I said, oh my god, why did I do this? They're still thinking they've been together for 10 years, so it worked out. She already had interest in him, so this was not the deal breaker that he was bad at role play. But it shows something important, that when uh one part of the couple goes out on a limb expressing an interest in something that is not reciprocated, this is really complicated.
Yes. Yeah, it really is. And I think, it would be nice to come up with some kind of neat philosophical conclusion where you say, and that's why it's okay. That's why it's no longer awkward and uncomfortable and
And
embarrassing.
everybody in the audience goes like, "Wait a minute! I thought this is a self-help guide. This Damon guy wrote it. What? There's no magic bullet in this book. I'm not
But
gonna
no, I
buy it."
mean if part of the point in writing this fantasy chapter was to really recognize that some fantasies are just um, not necessarily perverse, but strange, confronting, challenging, painful, um, unexpected. And if a couple cannot at least recognize that fantasy, they cannot work together as a couple,
Right.
because it means that there are going to be deep needs in one of them that are not even recognized, let alone fulfilled.
And this can come
Um,
very late in the game. People being married or together for a long time,
yeah.
right? And then
Yep.
somebody this I remember a friend of my father's who recently passed away. He was 85, and I bumped into them visiting my dad, and I asked him, "Helmut, how are you guys?" And he goes like, "Well, when you're my age, health is important, and having the same sexual preferences as your partner."
Yeah.
I
Yeah.
blushed a little
Exactly.
bit. He was like 80 years old, and but it was so spot on what he said there. Yeah.
Yeah. And it's, if indeed that's the person that you feel you want to be with, then that's the person that you should be talking to about
Mhm.
talking about this with. It's They ought to be the person who is able to recognize you for what you are, try to understand your situation, try to discuss what you want most out of life, and to decide whether or not that's something you're going to get together. I'm not saying that's easy. I'm just saying that's the kind of end game. Um,
Mhm.
it, you are with them presumably because they are the one who is most concerned with your well-being. And so, of course, it doesn't work like that, but that's the ideal.
Sai
um,
here in the local chat says decades, yes. And Sai, if you want to talk a little bit about, because Sai is a sex worker here in Second Life, and
yeah.
Chai says I have a friend who works as an escort for an agency that only has female lesbian clients. But Sai, if you want to talk about, men or women coming to you that cannot, I don't know, disclose to their real life partner or their Second Life partner about their preferences, that would be really interesting to hear about that. I want to talk about violent fantasies that you talk about in the book, and you introduce
Yes.
the reader to a Japanese author by the name of uh, Kono Taeko, or Taeko Kono. She passed away 2015, and she wrote a book in the 60s with short stories called Toddler Hunting, with very the protagonist has very violent fantasies. Talk a little bit about that, those stories, and what you found out about what that means in terms of fantasy. If fantasy is
Yep.
is going to lead to, I don't know, mass murder, mayhem, or
Yep.
whatnot, or
Yeah.
not.
Yeah. So, Akiko in this story, Akiko's boys, is a very, she's a lonely but sweet woman, and she's very kind to young boys. She hates little girls, and she likes giving them gifts, and she likes, she will have a fixation on a young boy, and she'll give him gifts and give him clothes, and then she might watch him wriggling in and out of his clothes, and then she's done and she moves on. Meanwhile, she has a sadomasochistic relationship with her boyfriend that she sees occasionally, but her kind of fantasy life
How
is
old is the
about,
protagonist in the story? Sorry to interrupt.
I believe she's in her late 20s or early 30s.
Hmm.
um, she has this fantasy life though, where she fantasizes about um, this violence upon these children, these young boys, and it's not sexual violence. It's just flat out violence, just the most horrific stuff, and I'm not going to talk about it. Um, and that's complicated enough because she wouldn't do any of these things, but that's what she fantasizes about. But even more the reason why this is such an amazing and confronting short story is that she herself sees herself as those young boys. She identifies with them. So part of what gets her off is the idea of herself being torn to pieces. It's just that she is in the position of those young boys. And that sort of leads me into a discussion about fantasy and how we discuss fantasy ethically, and how we make sense of um, the difference between fantasy as this weird, perverse sort of playground of urges and fantasy as a sort of plan of action. And it was really important for me to be clear that fantasy lives are not necessarily a plan of action. They're fantasy as fantasy. They're the psyche playing with themes that it gets off on that may have absolutely no relevance whatsoever to everyday life. And
And
the
Damon,
example I talk about, yeah,
sorry to jump in here, and also I think you suggest that it's also because the conventional wisdom, I think, sort of in casual conversation is always, oh yeah, I understand that person had a trauma, and then he or she is reliving the trauma of youth violence or whatever. So it's also more than that, right? It's not That's not the only explanation for having
exactly, yeah.
these
And
fantasies.
I do discuss how it is. People absolutely can work through their trauma in role play. And I have a chapter on bondage and domination, where there is research on people working through their trauma together in that kind of intimacy. But in this case, what I'm talking about is the reduction of fantasy to trauma and intent,
Hmm.
and it really isn't that. And the example I use is um, women who have violent sexual fantasies about themselves. And the sort of patriarchal conservative response to that has so often been, there you go, that proves they want it. But it's not that at all. If you look at the conversations with these women and the research, it shows that no, they are playing. That is their fantasy about a character, themselves, and what happens to that character, and they are in charge of that fantasy. That has absolutely nothing to do with the violation of autonomy that occurs when there is a sexual assault. This is, adults freely committing to a sense of their own abandon. It is not about um, it is not about rape. And yes, I completely agree, Saya, that men also have these sexual fantasies. Just that the research suggests that women are more likely to have these than men, and it it's often now there are people who have these fantasies as a result of abuse. I do talk about that in the chapter, but again, it becomes their fantasy,
Mm.
and they are, I wouldn't say freely, but
Well, the agency is
this
on there, and
exactly, this is an
yeah, they
aspect of their agency, and
yeah.
they are walking through their trauma in their fantasy life.
Mhm.
And it's really important to recognize that, because otherwise it just becomes yet another excuse for the erosion of people's sexual autonomy. And as Saya just said, society uses these fantasies very differently. They use women's fantasies against women for the benefit of men.
Well, surprised that we decode these complex things through the patriarchic lens.
Yeah, big, huge surprise there.
It's frustrating, but again, if you're just tuning in, we're out of time now. We're going to be around for a little while until the bottom of the hour, but this is the Second Life Book Club at a special time to accommodate our Australian friends, Damon Young
G'day,
with the
everyone.
book. Thank you. I actually have the one joke which was told to me by an Australian, so I'm not anti-Australian. I'm just relating to what I was told.
Oh, the
This
nice
Austra-
way to start. Yeah.
this Australian told me the joke. He says there are two kinds of Australians, and I go like, really? He goes like, yeah, one in front of the bar and one behind the bar. So
Uh,
Not stereotype much.
You know, our alcohol consumption is actually far less than many other nations, but go off, I guess.
I could believe it. I don't condone these types of jokes even about my own people, about the Bavarians running around in lederhosen and getting hammered at the Oktoberfest all day long either. Although that is certainly a large percentage. Now, completely off the rail of the tangents here, I would like Damon to read
Yeah.
from the introduction of the book where you relate an anecdote of your own uh, sexual awakening, I guess. And before we read, please, how was that decision? Was that a decision early on that you would intersperse, of course, anonymized, personal anecdotes to lead into these different topics? I think it's extremely effective, but I don't know if there were discussions with your wife or if you had doubts about that. How did you arrive at this? Was it a hard decision or was it pretty straightforward? Yeah, I'm going to do it.
Uh, I always wanted to exclude my own experience, but it was also very hard. It was very hard for myself, just thinking about my own intimate life, but it was also very difficult thinking about how to do justice to others. So
Right,
yes,
because you do have an encounter with a woman that wants you to be violent in bed,
yes,
and I
yes.
can imagine that. How do you? And again, really kudos, and everybody should get this book. It is really amazing, and all your books. I haven't read all of them. I read Distraction and The Art of Reading, but uh, it's very well done. How you actually accomplished to do that justice in very sensitive ways.
Thank you.
But yeah.
All right, so I'm going to read from the first chapter, which is entitled "The Classroom," on the sudden strangeness of sex. I will begin where this began for me. A's legs. It was the late 80s in a portable classroom. Black aluminium window frames, laminated tables with rounded edges, a wonky green blackboard, summer stuffiness. Perhaps the teacher, with thick rimmed glasses, high belted trousers, and a chronic sneer, perhaps the teacher was speaking, perhaps not. The lesson did not matter. I was looking at a classmate. A had her knees up on the desk and was rocking back and forth. It was enthralling, or more correctly, I was enthralled. Now, see, I had seen legs before alongside bellies and backs and chests. In first grade, one fellow pupil even pulled her underwear down, and I did the same. But this was hilarious, not arousing. As a young child, bodies were occasionally a joke, but mostly unseen and unexciting. But A's legs? They were suddenly very visible to me and not funny at all. They felt like an invitation. They were not, of course. She was oblivious to my existence, and I later realized my own obliviousness, casually turning another human being into a prop for my pleasure. But honesty is important here. It felt like her skin was there for me, was an offering. An offering of what? There were not even vague fantasies. For all my illusions of invitation, there was no address on the envelope, no party to attend. I had longing, but not for anything. This was pure yearning. And it seems awkward to use the word desire about a child. It seems anachronistic and crude. But the word does justice to my memories. I was 11 years old and feeling the beginnings of arousal, the buds of lust. It was a strange sensation. It felt familiar, this need. It was part of a well known world, the same uniforms and accents, chalk dust and pencil sharpenings. I was myself, surely. Yet this was totally new, novel enough for me to remember it decades later. Nothing in my childhood made sense of this. I had urges for lasagna or toy robots, but I wanted to eat or play with those. They had some obvious use. But A, she wasn't for anything, she was just there. Someone I had to look at because the mere existence of her calves and thighs gave me a gut ache, a pleasant gut ache. And this hat to look was also weird. I felt pushed into gazing. The urge felt intimate, like no one else could feel this way, and yet it felt like it wasn't mine. It was like the hand of a stranger at the back of my skull. Look, it shoved. Look. What had changed? She was the same, with the same goody two shoes demeanor. I was the one transformed, this odd longing rising up within me. It felt like the world had shifted too, though, like its meniscus had a new sheen. Her legs suddenly had charm, and this charisma spread across her whole persona, making her someone I wanted to know. And this had a curious physicality to it. I did not merely feel she was sexy, she was sexy. There was no naysaying this new reality. Put another way, my lust was now a part of the universe. And that is that.
And I have a slide for that with another quote on the book about lust. Lust becomes a fiend that somehow strips us of reason and freedom.
Yes.
You
And
have children, you have boys.
uh, yeah, boy and a girl.
Aha. How and how old are they?
13 and 16.
Ah, okay. Well, it's still it's starting. I have an 18-year-old and he is doing very well. He has a girlfriend, and as far as we know, he has his lust under control in the sense that it's consensual. But I am worried about guidance and also in a time of again I think I don't know. I'm going back to this sort of toxic masculinity thing, and again you're not
Yep.
you're not Jordan Peterson, thank God. And also, you're not Joe Rogan, so you can't really give medical advice. But if you were to, if you were to, you made it deduct that I'm not a fan. These people, but anyway, how would you? I guess the question is about how how did you deal with this awakening, if you can remember the rejection, the awakening, the control of lust as
Uh,
a young person.
oh,
I mean, you pulled your
yeah,
pants down when you were younger in school. We already know
yeah,
that,
yeah.
but
Okay,
but
so
you didn't become a fiend.
no, I didn't. And I suppose there's two aspects to that. It was very, very important for me to be very controlled. And I my sexual identity was defined in terms of what I didn't want to be. I didn't want to be one of those men just sort of blithely pumping away to their own ends. And I know this is a strange thing to say, but it was this kind of European cinema take on sex that I'd seen late at night after Watershed, when it was, Polish films where it's just these sad people having sad sex in sad beds. But also,
That's good. Yeah.
I was well aware of the reputation of men as just kind of selfish brutes. And again, this is a caricature, but that's the caricature I didn't want to be. And so I wanted to be very controlled, and I wanted to be very, consensual and caring. And that's partly why I didn't consent to strangling the girl who asked me to, because I couldn't reconcile that with my own notion of sexuality. Now, I now understand why she was asking, but at the time, I just couldn't do it. It was at odds with my sort of burgeoning persona. But, and this is really, really, really important, the fact that I personally wanted to be controlled and caring and disciplined and all those things um, does not mean I had any idea of the politics of sex,
Hmm.
the way in which I, as a man, was part of an enormous network of, um, privilege and benefit to which others were from which others were excluded, and the way in which sexuality is shot through with gender and ethnicity and class, and wealth. So, um,
But you lucked out in a sense because I mean, I remember in high school things are groups and cliques and people who defined themselves over they had adopted already a misogynistic approach. I mean, I was a musician. I was in a completely sort of different group of people there as well, kind of an outcast, if you will. But when I went back to my high school reunion, frankly, you see a lot of people that have not grown up at all in that
No,
regard 30
no.
years later.
Yeah, and look, I listened to a lot of rap music, and a lot of that was highly misogynistic,
Yeah.
and you know, listening to that and enjoying that was part of a kind of horrible braggart, sort of boastful sense of masculinity that I was trying on for myself, essentially as a defense mechanism. But by the time I had a girlfriend, I just wanted to be a good boyfriend.
Mhm.
I wanted to, you know, I wanted to safely give her pleasure.
But if you hadn't gotten that girlfriend, maybe you would have drifted off into toxic
It's
masculinity.
entirely possible. I've been lucky in my intimate relationships, put it that way.
Mhm. Now we have about 10 minutes left, so there's so many comments, and please pick them up. And Ty is saying good, great stuff. People say, Stella says, would you say that the common vision of sexuality conflicts with ideas of masculinity?
Um,
You mean, Stella? You mean by common vision, by equality among genders? Actually, I have a question about your treating, and when I talked with Shyla about pre-show about the subjects, and Shyla re- uh, does research for the show. What I found interesting, she asked about me having read the book. The only person in the crew has read the book. She asked if you differentiate between homo and heterosexuality, and I felt like I think you treat it very equally among all these different lenses that you look through, and I thought that that was a really interesting and very good choice. I mean, this is
yeah.
sorry, I'm evading Stella's question, but Stella,
Um,
please, yeah.
yeah. So it's just to respond to that quickly, Drax. I wanted to make sure that the book included as many um, kinds of sexuality in terms of gender and orientation as I possibly could. I did not want it to be as, you know, uh, the kind of straight man's guide to getting a leg over. Just really not what I wanted to write about. So um, some of my favorite aspects, in fact, of writing this book was reading as much literature from, say, you know, queer women of color or trans writers as possible.
Yeah.
And the chapter on sex workers, the only quotes in that chapter are from sex workers. So
And you
if
accomplish by that approach really accomplishes an extremely inclusive result, I feel. I felt
Yeah,
like
and so
Fleur had to go ahead.
I'm drawing on other research, but the only people quoted in the chapter are sex workers, for, you know, former or current. And I'm not pretending that that gives us some immediate access to the whole truth of sex work, but I just wanted to kind of spotlight them rather than me. And in answer to Stella's question, I'm not sure if I'm reading the question correctly, but I would say that our common ideas of sexuality are still highly masculine. That is, they come from a system that is set up by and for men. So they have all kinds of notions of conquest and of women's trickery and virile masculinity, active men and passive women, women kind of enveloping men like goo, and men being these hard jabbing objects that conquer. It's really twisted, but the shorter answer to the question is no. I would say there are definitely conflicts in there, but in general, they're not in conflict.
Mhm. I'm not sure I understand this question, a common vision or future of sort of gender equality. Um, I agree with Damon about the dominance of male ideas, how things should pan out. Jamonkey has a fun comment. He says, "Straight Man's Guide to Getting a Leg Over, greatest title ever." So
Coming soon.
quickly trademark this. um,
And I should add one thing.
yeah.
We, you know, there are men and women who get off on being dominated, and they do so freely and knowingly and consensually within intimate relationships with one or more people. We should absolutely not confuse that with political and economic structures of domination.
Mm.
And question here about sex and disability.
Yeah,
Um,
Cody, thank you for this question.
yes,
Sex and disability, and I'll put some links to a film that we made a long time ago, and also the film that Cody's in. Go ahead, Damon.
yes. I haven't written as much about it as I would like to, but one of the things that I came across while researching this was the enormous contribution that people with disabilities have made to, for example, the technologies of sex, to not only kind of teledildonics, but other kinds of sort of sex machines or prosthetics or clothing. And it's taken up into the mainstream, and the contribution of people with disabilities is so often forgotten. It just becomes, oh, this is just something we use and enjoy. But originally, they were, they were someone using their own experience to innovate and to celebrate their own sexuality and those of other people in their community. And yeah, that usually gets dropped out. Um,
I'm putting
I,
the link to our doc we did for German television back in 2011 called Log into Life that profiles sexuality in virtual worlds around disability, World of Warcraft, and Second Life. And as Damon said, the innovation specifically here to also hardware devices and such, but also the kind of freedom that virtual worlds provide for people with mobility issues and other disabilities. Um, Highly recommend this film. It's on you can buy it on but you can get it free. This is semi legally on my unlisted YouTube channel. Shyla asked,
and
"Can you explain the Beetlebox? Because Ludwig Wittgenstein has a thing with
yeah.
Beetlebox, and we have a few minutes left. Okay, this is the last question. The Beetlebox. It comes on time and again in your book. Ludwig
Mhm.
Wittgenstein, a very important philosopher of the 20th century. Go ahead.
Okay, so the beetle in the box was Wittgenstein's thought experiment as a response to common ideas of sort of language and culture, language especially, um, and how we understand others. So he talks about, imagine someone has a beetle in a box, and everyone has a beetle in their own box, and you can't look inside and see the beetle, but there's a beetle in there, and everyone talks about this beetle. They have conversations about this beetle, but no one sees the beetle. There may not be a beetle in there, or what they call a beetle might not be what you call a beetle. The interesting thing about that thought experiment is it doesn't matter. The beetle drops away, people still have these conversations and understand one another. The point he's making with this typical Wittgensteinian thought experiment is that with something like pain, um, we don't need to experience others' pain directly to have a meaningful conversation about pain,
Hmm.
um, to understand the concept of pain. And his broader point there is we're social creatures. We don't come together as discrete little atomic individuals and then find one another. We emerge as humans within language, within culture, where we already have shared conventions about what such and such means and how to say it. And um, that in turn was how I make sense of other people's pleasure. I don't know what it feels like for my lovers to get pleasure. I don't know what it feels like for other men to enjoy certain things, let alone women who may have different bits to me. But even if we have exactly the same bits, we're going to experience pleasure differently. There are things that some men like that I just find gross. Um, Now, we seemingly have the same physiology, the same kind of makeup, where we might be, white heterosexual men in the same culture, and yet we don't experience the same things as pleasure at all. And what I'm arguing there is we don't need to in order to give each other pleasure. We just have to engage in a conversation. We have to learn the practices um, that others enjoy. So that's kind of where the beetle in the box meets good lovin', is that they're both about initiating us into practices of communication rather than assuming we have to open up someone's skull and peek in there in order to give them pleasure.
A wonderful place to end here. And I put up this quote of you in the book: "There is no escape from paradox. To have sex is to accept the possibility of ambiguity and ambivalence." On Getting Off, an absolutely fantastic book. Again, not a self-help book. If you want that, get go over and watch Jordan Peterson, but don't come
Do
back.
not.
Precisely, this is what I mean. Um, Damon, this is really awesome that we had you here. Thank you so much, and thank you for your wonderful work. I can again highly recommend this book and many others. The Distraction book, The Art of Reading. Also here on the table is Philosophy in the Garden, which I haven't read, but you just have a wonderful talent in bringing, I don't know, demystifying a term that brings out cold sweats uh, in some people for whatever the reason is. Um, yeah, so
Thank you for having me. It's been a pleasure as always, Drax. And thanks everyone for coming. I really appreciate your time and your
we'll have
attention.
we'll get more Australians in the future. This is actually a good time. We need to establish this hour also for the audience is not familiar with this hour. I'm going to quickly go through the credits and then we'll wrap it. People can, of course, stick around. I also want to say Cody said here, what about disabled sex? He said, I'll help. So Cody is an expert in this.
Oh, excellent.
Ask ask Cody and again check out Our Digital Selves. I didn't link that one. That's the film that features Cody quite heavily. Cody is a important part of this film. Second Life Book Club every Wednesday, 12 o'clock Pacific time. And I also apologize on Twitter, my snafu with the time zones. Oh my God, this time zone thing is nuts. I thought I had it down. Suggestions for guests, slbookclub at Draxtor.com. The show is produced by Isabel Sharon, Shyla, the Super Gecko, and myself. Location manager, master builder, Ruby Geek. She's not with us today. She built this, and there's a tip jar on the side that all goes to the volunteer team. The avatars are made by Ruby. The research is by Shyla. We have a lot of sponsors that give us free 3D assets and avatar components. So please go out and seek them out and tell them we sent you. Again, 12 o'clock every Wednesday. We're back to the normal time next week. There's a Flickr group. There's a Discord. There's everything. SL Book Club at Draxler.com. And again, do not forget to hit the tip jar if you have some loose Linden dollars in your pants. Put them into the tip jar. Thank you very much for also the folks on YouTube watching on YouTube. Please consider subscribing and joining the YouTube channel. We have three levels of membership on the YouTube channel now: Drax Fan, Drax Bro, and Drax Stan. There's a lot of Damon, I gotta go with the times. The kids tell me you got to do it, so I'll just do it.
Sure.
What are we gonna do? Uh, but there is a lot of really cool perks. I mean, if I weren't already the Dragster, I would be a Drax stand for sure. I'll invest in that. Next week, Caroline Hardaker. Oh my God, I hope I don't butcher her name. She has a new book called Composite Creatures out from Angry Robots. We're back in with speculative fiction, and that's next week, right here on the Second Life Book Club. Goodbye.